Hey, welcome everyone. Welcome to the third and final day of this FLUXNet methane data wrangling data wrangling workshop. Today we're going to shift gears a little bit and we're going to really spend some time thinking about a bit more about methane and gap filling methane. We're going to get an overview of some recent approaches for gap filling methane, some tutorials. We'll think about future approaches, and then we're going to end it's sort of the later part of the morning session, thinking about, merging FluxNet methane and FluxNet, right? Really, these two parallel efforts sort of arose because FluxNet was originally designed for CO2, sensible and latent heat flux, because there weren't as many methane measurements historically. But now, as we have more and more methane measurements, it's really time, as Dario mentioned, to start bringing in methane into FluxNet. So our first presentation today will be from Gavin McNicol, who's going to give us an overview of some of the work that he led on gap-filling methane fluxes. So Gavin.
Hi there. Thanks, Sarah. I'll just share my screen. Okay, so yeah, I'd like to give this overview about um, our gap filling work, which is now seems like a long time ago, 2021 when this was published. It is a fairly comprehensive um, attempt to learn about gap filling of methane with machine learning methods, and I do think the paper is a good reference because we worked with computer science students. So that's the two lead authors here, Jeremy Irvin and Sharon Zhu, um, are computer science students at Stanford, and they did a great job, I think, kind of stepping the non-expert machine learning person through this process. So I think in terms of understanding the workflow and the best practices, it's still a good reference to go to. So gap filling is a time series imputation problem. So that's a statistical process where we're using a statistical process to replace missing values with substituted values. And the goal is, primarily to have complete time series to quantify daily, seasonal, annual, site level methane budgets. Um, and the challenge is that methane is highly variable at multiple timescales. And what we learned in part is that there's sites are incredibly different from each other. And so they present different challenges to gap filling approaches. And so at the time of our, excuse me, at the time of our study, there were clear standards for CO2 flux gap filling, but not the same equivalent standards for methane. And so I think that conversation continues to today. At the time, there was a exploration of machine learning based methane gap filling at a few high latitude sites, led by Sigurd Dengel. But maybe just to start to illustrate that idea that methane is distinctive and presents unique challenges to gap filling approaches, let's just look at some data. So this is a week of data at the start of the growing season in a California marsh. California marsh. This is a location where it's close to the Pacific Ocean. There's an onshore breeze that develops every day. And so during the daytime, there's really almost optimal conditions for eddy covariance-based flux measurements. But you can see that there are gaps. These gaps that appear are primarily at night when we get more stable conditions. And this is a pretty common feature of data after it's been filtered for poor quality flux conditions. When we zoom out to a month, we can still see those kind of nighttime gaps. But at this site, we have about 60% data coverage in this particular time series. And so at the annual scale, it does become harder to see exactly when those gaps are falling. There's no month-long gaps in this time series. But you can see that there's still 40% of this annual time series is missing, and it's largely those nighttime conditions in this case. So I think it's a reasonable question to ask, does it matter how we impute the values? And so this is just a little thought experiment this is one way we can plot the cumulative methane flux for the site. Um, and so the black line in the middle of this spread is if we were to impute the time series, the missing values with the median of the surrounding values. And then the other lines either above or below that black line are whether we choose kind of a higher or lower percentiles of values um, around that median. And so when you add that kind of bias, if you will, effect across the whole year, add that across the whole year, you arrive at a pretty different cumulative sum for the year. So maybe plus or minus 12 to 15% difference. So I guess I would say it does make a difference. It's important to get this right. Um, so in our study, we selected 17 sites from the FLUXNet methane data set. We intentionally chose those that covered a wide geographic range. We had one site, at least one site from some of the major wetland or rice classifications in the data set. And then we were interested in doing some comparisons, kind of apples to apples comparisons about the choices of predictors that we use in the machine learning models. And so we were restricted there because not all sites had soil predictors. So we were particularly interested in including soil temperature and some measure of moisture in the soil as a predictor. So these sites all included those additional soil predictors. So this is, apologize, it's a little bit small here, but this is a plot from the figure from the paper that is trying to visualize the differences in data coverage across these 17 sites. The percentages at the top are the total data coverage for the on average for a given site year, and you can see that from left to right, you're looking at through an average site year, and then the vertical axis is the percentage of data coverage. So you can see that at that site we were just looking at, USMYB, it's a relatively high data coverage site, but it's actually seasonally skewed towards kind of the middle of the year when we have stronger winds and higher fluxes. And but you can see some sites have really long gaps. This light gray color indicates a gap of greater than 12 days. 12 days was a threshold value that we had noticed in Sigrid Dengel's paper and the Moffat paper that seemed to correspond with a breakdown in the quality of gap-filled values. So we used that as kind of an initial gauge of how well we might do at different sites. But you can see, yeah, there's this huge spread in data coverage for methane fluxes at wetlands, and sometimes quite low, 10% or something. So in addition to just applying some machine learning models, by working with this computer science group, they were interested in making some advances, and they were particularly interested in three questions. One was, how do we simulate artificial gaps that closely resemble the natural gaps and don't distort the data? How do we make sure that we separate the process of model development and selection from model testing? And that's particularly important. I think it's something that computer scientists and sort of people in AI on a day-to-day basis are thinking about a lot, making sure that they don't have information bleed from the process of model development through to that final evaluation. And then finally, how to quantify uncertainty. And I think this is actually still an unresolved dimension that I hope the workshop can shed some light on. So for the art of simulating the natural gaps, to evaluate these models, you have to introduce artificial gaps into the time series. And I have a visual of that in a minute. The first thing you can do is just look at the natural gap length distribution. So we have a frequency plot here of different gap lengths from 1/2 hour up to 40 half hours in this case. And you can imagine that if you introduce half hours sort of randomly as artificial gaps, you're going to skew the distribution away from short gap lengths towards longer gap lengths, because in some cases you might have two gaps, natural gaps separated by a single observation. And when you introduce the artificial gap, you join them up and it suddenly it's a longer gap length. So in doing so, you're sort of distorting the distribution of gap lengths in the natural data set. And so they came up with a neat algorithm that is in the code base that we'll be working with today, that will weight the gap length introductions such that the final evaluation time series most closely resemble the original distribution here on the left. So just as an example of that, there's two sites here with the observed gap length distribution on the left. And then the artificial gaps you can see are skewed a little bit towards the shorter end. And that means once they've been introduced, you actually preserve the distribution that you see on the left in that final observed plus artificial gaps distribution. So it's a nice addition, I think, that we can take advantage of in the code that's available to us through this project. So that's one take home. The other question they were interested in was, how can we make sure that the best practices of machine learning are are being adhered to in this process? How do we make sure that model selection is separate from model testing? And so there's a nice figure in the paper that breaks down what's actually happening with the artificial gap generation. And so we can imagine we have some time series with natural observed gaps in black. The first thing that the workflow does is it generates a test set where it uses that algorithm to introduce a set of gaps here in kind of bright pink. And then actually after that test set is created, it's set aside and is not used again during the model development until the very, very end. And so then on top of that, there's a further set of 10 independent validation sets that are generated using the same algorithm that preserves the natural gap spread distribution. And so now you have 10 essentially training sets, or in this case, we're calling them validation sets that we can use to train 10 machine learning models, an ensemble of machine learning models, and generate evaluation metrics. So at this point, we wanted to test different machine learning models. We wanted to test different combinations of predictors, but this same set of 10 validation sets was used to train and evaluate under each of those different conditions. And so just showing one of three panels of a figure that we have. It's kind of an evaluation figure. So there's the three metrics of evaluation were the R squared. So looking at the time series correlations, the bias, but then also I think what's typically the most frequently used loss function for machine learning based models is some measure of the error. So this is the normalized mean absolute error. And here the normalization is just taking that absolute error and dividing it by the standard deviation of the fluxes at the site. And so that's a way of allowing us to generate a comparable metric across sites that really vary in their inherent variance. So you can see here that we picked 4 different model algorithms. So we had a lasso regression, kind of standard neural network, random forest, and then this XGBoost is very similar to a random forest, but rather than growing trees kind of at the same time and independently, the model grows a decision tree in sequence, learning kind of progressively one after another. And it has shown some improvements relative to random forests in other studies. But you can see here that when you're using the code base, you can generate plots like this to evaluate the performance of a range of different models and a range of different predictor combinations. And so the general pattern we saw was that the neural nets, the random forest, and XGBoost all performed well and slightly better than sort of the more standard lasso regression approach. I'm not showing this here, but we did also implement a version of the MDS method that's used for CO2. And these better performing machine learning models did do better than the MDS, which is kind of why I think when I talk about this, I generally don't show that comparison as much. I think we're sort of shifted to using machine learning for methane. And in terms of these predictors, the first 2 groups, meteorological and temporal, meteorological is, I think, air pressure wind speed, and air temperature. And then temporal is kind of a range of cosine and sine functions that try to anticipate that there is a wave-like form to the seasonality and maybe even the diurnal signal. And so you can see as we add predictors, as we add these temporal predictors, we do better in almost every case, especially in these neural net and random forest decision tree models. The orange baseline predictor set is actually Sara's kind of configuration predictor set that has gone into was used in the gap filling procedure for the FluxNet methane data set. So we call that kind of the baseline. And as you can see, that's doing really well. And then in many cases, and then what we wanted to do was say, all right, if we include soil temperature and soil moisture measurements captured by this all predictors, we just allowed the model to kind of work across all the available data. We wanted to see if there was any improvement, and there's a slight sense that it does better in some cases, but there is this outlier here, so it seems like it's a marginal improvement in this kind of broad overview. So what I just described, you can go through yourself. If you work with this code base, you can generate your own plots for your own select models, your own combinations of predictors, and evaluate what you think is the best combination, looking kind of across all of these. And so just returning to that idea that we want to separate model selection from model testing, once you've selected the model you want to proceed with, so maybe you want to proceed with a random forest with the all predictor set, which is kind of what we looked at. I'm going to skip this because I gave this analogy last time. Once you've selected your model and predictor set, you can then apply that final selected model to the test set. And that's a step that I think is sometimes missed in, as earth scientists and environmental scientists are getting to grips with machine learning. We've made decisions to get to this point that it's probably an iterative process. And so we can sometimes that can sometimes lead to overfitting that it's not really easy for us to anticipate, but we might be doing a little bit better here than we actually would do under new conditions, which is of course what we want to use the model for. So to make sure that to actually get a good test of the model performance, we want to go back to that test set that we set aside earlier on and evaluate the model against that single test set, held out set. And so here, this is a fairly complicated plot, but it's a Taylor diagram that lets us just visualize multiple metrics on the same 2D space. And the basic pattern here is that we want the models to get as close to this little star at the bottom here. That would be a perfect model. And so there's a couple of things to mention here. One is that this is a nice way to visualize that multi-metric evaluation for that final test set. You can sort of see where your site's falling. If you're doing multiple sites or multiple site years, you could see, relative improvements among those. In this case, we actually wanted to compare how well this random forest and all predictor combination was doing versus the essentially Sara's neural net and baseline predictor set. So you can see that there was some cases where we saw improvement. So moving from this point here, the baseline and neural net to the random forest and all, there's a bit of an improvement, but they're nothing terribly drastic. And in some cases, no improvement. But you can visualize that sort of improvement on these plots. And I think the other take home is that there's a wide spread in performance among sites if we're looking at it in terms of these metrics. The red colors here are bogs, and a lot of times these high latitude bogs have relatively low fluxes, relatively low seasonality compared to the inherent noise and variance in the data. And so you can imagine an R squared, a correlation metric, is almost always going to look quite bad when you have a minimal seasonal signal relative to the kind of background variability that's in methane flux data. And so yeah, this is a workflow that lets us separate the development of the model from the final evaluation. And then the third piece that they worked on, but I don't think is entirely resolved, is quantifying uncertainty. And I'll go through this pretty quickly because I think it is still an unresolved question, but essentially we've trained 10 models, which means we have 10 sets of predictions. We can use that to calculate the parameters of distribution. So we can say we can calculate and use the mean prediction, but we can also calculate the variance or the standard deviation to become distribution parameters. And in the preceding slides and in the paper, we worked with the Laplace distribution because that's shown up a lot in other in flux data distributions. And so we're able to characterize the distribution, and we can look at the spread of the data from the spread of the predictions from these 10 models and compare that to the variance present in the data. And so this is a coverage plot. And so it's showing for each site where we have this spread of 10 machine learning based predictions. The students noticed that that in every case the uncertainties are too confident. So the spread and the predictions is relatively narrow compared to the inherent variability of the data. And so they had the idea of scaling the uncertainties generated from the gap filling models to at least match the natural variability of the data. And so this was done with something called Platt scaling, and that's also implemented in the code base. And so after scaling, you can see that the uncertainties kind of match the natural variability. And just to visualize that, on the left, you have some observed methane fluxes. In the middle, you have an uncalibrated, an unscaled gap-filled time series. This is including the uncertainties generated from the 10 predictions. And then after scaling, you can see that the uncertainties match better. I say this is not resolved because I don't think it's necessarily perfect. But there is in terms of the magnitude of the uncertainty. And this is a final slide just to show that make a big difference about on the annual sum uncertainty. So these are 4 different sites with the sum from the mean prediction, and then the uncalibrated uncertainties are pretty small. But when we calibrate, you can see that there's a 10-fold increase in the uncertainty at the annual time step. And so I think we'll have a discussion about improvements going later on today. But there are some ways we might be able to improve gap filling, different models, partitioning fluxes possibly to simplify the signals. But I think the next thing on the agenda is a tutorial that Fali has developed building off of this flux gap fill code base. That's kind of the basis of the paper. I'm sorry I ran a little bit long there, but thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Gavin. That was a very nice overview. I see a couple questions in the chat here. We'll have a few minutes for questions now, and then I think we'll have a lot of time after this session for discussion, so we can get into that a little bit more. David was wondering, what is the percentage of data used for testing? Do you happen to know that or remember that?
Yeah, I think it was 10% each time. So each time we use the algorithm to generate either a test or a validation set, it was 10% of the data.
Okay, great. And then, yeah, Bhaskar made a comment on computational time, and that's, something that I think is a very important point, but we could probably discuss a little bit more afterwards. I mean, obviously, if you're running this on your own, you can sort of decide that. I guess one question becomes, when we apply this to all the sites across FluxNet that have methane, the computational time does become quite important. So perhaps we can save that one for our discussion afterwards, but it is an important point, as Bhaskar noted. Any other last question for Gavin? Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Gavin. And I look forward to continued discussion. I know uncertainty is something I agree is yet unresolved for methane. And yeah, it would be nice to work together as a community on that a little bit more. Wonderful, thank you. So as Gavin mentioned, next we're gonna have Fa, who's gonna lead us through how to implement this code in Python. So Fa, you can go ahead.
Right, let me share my screen. Da, 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 da. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, yeah.
Go to full screen. Oh, no. Okay. Yeah. Hello everyone. Very happy to give a tutorial about our current methane flux gap filling pipeline. My name is Fa from Stanford University. As Gavin introduced this kind of pipeline, the first version is led by Gavin and Jeremy Irvin from Stanford Computer Science Department. And we are now working with Gavin and Jeremy Irvin and Sara and June here together for this pipeline for our FLUXNet methane version 2 data sets. So for this kind of tutorial, I will more introduce this kind of pipeline, like the key concept in this kind of pipeline and key parameter setting in this kind of pipeline. After this kind of tutorial, I will give a step-by-step tutorial, just very short tutorial, so that you can do this kind of gap filling using this kind of pipeline for your own data set. Again, like as Gavin introduced, why we need gap filling, because our original data set have some missing values as shown in the lower left side. The blue point represent observed methane fluxes, and red box represents some gaps in the data sets. And it's kind of at half-hourly scale. So if we want to aggregate this kind of half-hourly data set with missing value to like daily, weekly, monthly, or annual scale, we need first to gap fill this kind of missing value at a half-hourly scale. So we need the gap filling. And actually, the gap filling is kind of a regression issue. It includes three steps. The first step is to use blue points. These kind of blue points have like well-known like predictors and also methane flux like FCH4. And using these kind of predictors and methane flux, we can fit a model like a machine learning model. The second step, we use a well-trained machine learning model and the predictors of the missing value in the red box to get the like methane flux for the missing values. Then the third step, we quantify the estimated methane flux for these kind of missing values to quantify their uncertainty. So the red figure is quite simple. It shows the whole pipeline. Basically, we need the predictors of the missing value. Then we input into a well-trained models, and then we estimate the methane flux for these kind of missing values and estimate its uncertainty. For the predictors, in previous study have been different kind of predictors introduced, used, like in Sara and Kyle's paper. They use a temporal variable like day of the year and also time step information and also meteorological variables that have shown very important influence on the like methane dynamics. Here, for example, they use air temperature, shorter wave radiation, wind speed, and air pressure is kind of meteorological variable because these kind of variables are available for most of the sites. And for Jeremy's paper, actually they explored all these kind of combinations of variable, including other variable like soil temperature, soil water content, water table depth, NE, GPP respiration. These kind of variables are also very important for methane dynamics, but sometimes, like for example, in some sites, they didn't measure these kind of variables. So for some sites, this kind of variable may be not available to be used for the gap filling. So for your own sites, like in our gap filling pipeline, there is a parameter called predictors you can select what kind of predictor use for your gap filling pipeline based on the availability of the variables in your data set. For example, you can specify here as a list in the Python library, just like air temperature, air pressure, shuttle radiation, wind speed. You just specify this kind of predictor list used in the pipeline. Then the pipeline will use this kind of predictor for the gap filling. For the models, also different study use different kind of model. In Sara Knox paper, is used artificial neural network (ANN), and Kim paper they use ANN random forest and SVM, and Jeremy paper use like ANN random forest, lasso, XGBoost, and also MDS. It will be hard for some people if they are not familiar with this kind of machine learning model. So in our current pipeline, you just need to specify the parameter named models. It's also kind of list. You just specify what kind of model will be used in the gap filling pipeline. It can be one model, like here random forest model, RF, AN model for artificial neural network, and lasso, XGBoost, XGB. You can specify one or multiple models used for your gap filling. And another part is very important, as Gavin mentioned in his slides, is like data sampling. How you sampling data set into training, validation, and test the data set. It also vary across different kind of studies. Like in Sara and Kyle paper, they use a cluster method. Like key means the first cluster the data set based on their predictors. Then they select some training and validation and test the data set from each cluster. And in Kim and Jeremy paper, they use a random cross validation and also the data sampling strategy. Consider the gap length distribution. For example, there are some gaps only with one missing value. It's a short gap. But there are some gaps like with continuous several gaps or longer gaps. This kind of gap length will affect the model performance. So it will be important to consider this kind of gap length during the data split. In our current data processing pipeline, there is a parameter called split method. You can select what kind of method used to split the dataset into training, validation, or test dataset. If you select a random, it will use a random cross validation. If you select like artificial, it will use the data sampling strategy. Consider the gap length distributions. I will introduce more details about these two data sampling strategy or data sampling. Oh, get stuck. Yeah. For the data sampling strategy, random cross validation, for the raw data set, it mainly includes two parts. One is the missing values. The other is the effective measurements. For this kind of effective measurements, for the random cross validation, we just randomly select some part of the data set as the training and validation data set. For example, 90% of the effective measurements as the training and validation data set, and the other 10% of the data sets as a testing data set. This kind of data sampling strategy is very computational efficient and very fast and easy to understand. But it may have some problems, like as Gavin introduced. For the missing values, if we plot the gap length distribution as shown in this kind of green color, we can find that most of the gaps are distributed with shorter gaps. Their gap length may be 1 or 2, and there are fewer longer gaps. But for this kind of if we use, for example, a random cross validation, we also randomly select some test data set as the missing values. It's called artificial missing values. We plot these gap lengths. Their distribution would be different from the true gap distribution. For example, they have lower distribution with shorter gaps and higher distribution for the longer gaps. Because the machine learning model performance on the shorter gaps and the longer gaps are different, For example, we can imagine if there is only one gap, the model may like show a higher performance. But if it's a continuous several gaps connected, the model may show a worse performance. So this kind of gap length distribution would affect the model performance during the test set. So it would be good to consider this kind of gap length distribution. And in our current data processing pipeline, the gap filling pipeline, there are parameter called split method. If you want to consider this kind of gap length distribution during the data split, you just specify the parameter as artificial. And also another thing is about the uncertainty quantification. As Gavin mentioned, this kind of part is still ongoing. But here I just introduced the current parameters or what's the key concept in the current data processing pipeline. One key concept is random uncertainty. It's half-hourly skew. Basically, the random uncertainty, like if even under the same environment conditions with the same sensor, we may have different kinds of measurements related to the random uncertainty. And for each time step, for example, time step T, we may have like 10 models. Why we have 10 models? Because we either like include multiple models to do the gap filling, or we do the data split 10 times. So we have 10 training data sets. Then we use the 10 training data set to train the models and get 10 models. Is 10 models just an example? You can specify like a 20 models or more or fewer. For each time step, we have 10 models. Based on this kind of 10 model estimates, we can get the mean and the standard deviation of the model estimate method flux at each time step. Based on this kind of model estimates, we assume like distribution. For example, here Laplace distribution, assume their random uncertainty follow this kind of Laplace distribution. Based on this kind of Laplace distribution and the mean standard deviation, we can estimate like the 95 confidence interval of the random uncertainty and use this kind of confidence interval to represent the random uncertainty. As Gavin introduced, sometimes we use a mean and standard deviation to, and we assume the Laplace distribution, we may underestimate the uncertainty range. So in our pipeline, there is a process called maximum likelihood estimate. Basically, it updates the scale parameter in this kind of Laplace distribution and get an updated 95% percent confidence interval so that this kind of interval can more reasonably reflect the random uncertainty range. And we also introduce two metrics. One is the calibration evaluation. Basically, it quantifies how much percentage of the observations falling into this kind of uncertainty range. If there are more observations falling into this kind of uncertain range, it may mean that we overestimate this kind of uncertain range, and we need a narrowed uncertain range. So there's another like evaluation metric called sharpness evaluation. Basically, it quantifies the width of the confidence interval. And for our current pipeline, there's a parameter called distribution. You can specify what kind of distribution you assume for the random uncertainty. There are two distributions. One is the Laplace distribution, another is normal distribution. You don't need to care about all these kind of like details like a maximum likelihood estimate, also this kind of evaluation metric. You don't need to consider the details, and the model can output these kind of things. And you just need to specify the parameter, like what kind of distribution you assume that random error follow this kind of uncertainty. Another uncertainty is the cumulative uncertainty. The random uncertainty, as I mentioned, is at the half-hourly scale. Then with a half-hourly gap-filled time series for each set year, we have the like gap-filled a whole year time series from day 1 to the last day of the year. Like here, from day 1 to the last day of the year, because we have like 10 models, then we can add them, sum them together, get the annual budget or annual sum. Because we have 10 models, we will have like 10 model estimates of annual sum or annual budgets. Based on this kind of 10 model estimates, we will get the mean budgets and also its standard deviations. And this kind of standard deviation will be used to quantify the uncertainty of the community annual uncertainty. And again, there will be a scale issue as I introduced in my previous slides. It's related to the random error distribution. And also, like here, just introduce 10 models. Again, you can specify how many models you used based on your model selection and also your data splits. After having this kind of key concept and the key parameters, I will do the step-by-step tutorial. Like it's mainly include like 5 steps. First is download the code. You can scan the QR code here to access the GitHub. The link is here. Because we are still trying to debug the code, try to make the code to ready used for the ONEFlux, EuroFlux dataset, and also the FLUXNet method version 2. So it's still under development. You can access this kind of link. You can either download as a zip or just use git clone command to download the code. Then after downloading the code, you can save and unzip this kind of code into your project folder. This kind of folder is on your own PCs. Here, just an example. For example, I just saved this kind of code under this kind of directory. And when you open this directory, the files are organized like this, like a FLUXNet, a flux gap field. This kind of folder include the core code used for the gap filling, and this is a tutorial I will introduce more. It's a start point, a very simple start point. You can directly run this script to do the gap filling for your own site, and also it includes the Word version documents and also the other tutorials. The third step is just simply build a data folder. Like here, just an example. Under this kind of directory, I built a folder named data. You can specify your data folder in your own PC. And this kind of data folder will be used to store your own site data set. Like the fourth step is to prepare your own site. Like here, just a very simple example. I just download a site from a ONEFlux website. It's the site name is CBU. And I create a folder to store this kind of raw data set or the site data of this CBU site. You can specify this kind of site folder name with your own site name. For example, if your site name is just an example, if your site name is USABC, you can create a data folder at USABC and replace this kind of USABC with this kind of CBU. And the raw.csv is the site data you will be used to gap filling. And you can replace this kind of raw.csv with your own site data set, but name it as raw.csv because the current pipeline will access this kind of CSV to do the gap filling. And there have been some update in our current pipeline, and now it can support the ONEFlux base data format and also the ONEFlux process data format, because these kind of two data formats have a little bit of difference. And also, it's you can use your own data source. And finally, is the last step. You can simply run this kind of hello getFill.py, this kind of script, just doing the get filling for your own site. in the next slides, I will introduce more detail about this kind of script. If you open this kind of script, you will see this kind of code with very detailed comments, try to help you understand the concept and parameter setting of this pipeline. For example, the dir is the data directory I have introduced in my previous slides. You can specify your own data directory, and the sites is the site name of your own site. You can replace this kind of site name with your own site. Here, just again an example like CABU is a site name, and the model is a list. You can specify what kind of machine learning model you will use. And RF here just a random forest, which means only one model is used in this kind of tutorial. And predictors, you can specify your own predictors. It's just a Python list. Here, just again, an example, like air temperature, air pressure, short wave radiation, and wind speed. And the data source, here just use, because it's downloaded from the ONEFlux base data set, so it's just named as ONEFlux base. You can replace this kind of data source with your own data source. For example, you can name it as my own, so it represents your own data source. And then when you prepare this kind of a site and the predictors and the model, you can run the functions. The preprocess function is used to split the entire data set into training, validation, and test the data sets. Based on the split method you select here, the split method is the random, which means it uses random cross validation to do the data split process. And you can also specify like artificial, which considers the gap length distribution. After this preprocess function, you can run train, test, and gap fill. The train function is just use to train your machine learning models, and the test is to test your model performance over some like holdout data set, which means the machine learning model didn't see this kind of data sets during the training process, and will be this kind of test data set will be used to evaluate the model performance. Then after training test, you will run a gap fill. This kind of gap fill function will like provide estimate methane flux value for the estimate methane flux for the missing values, and also quantify the gap fill uncertainty. That's the tutorial for the gap filling. And if you have any questions about the code, about the data processing pipeline, of course, this kind of pipeline will keep updated. If you have any question about this kind of pipeline or code, you can contact me through my email. I will stop here. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Fa. So just a couple small notes on that, and I see some questions in the chat, so we can go through that as well. Note that if you've been following along the data wrangling tutorial sections, we haven't yet integrated this code into our data pipeline, but if you do format your data for ONEFlux submission, you can then run this separately with that formatted data. But keep in mind that if you take data off the ONEFlux website, it's not U-star filtered. So you can add, and we'll add some instructions on this in our instruction pipeline on how to output a U-star filtered column so that you can then run this pipeline on that. So we haven't quite finished fully integrating this, but since Fa's been developing this for FLUXNet methane, it's slightly different than what we've been introducing so far, but the random forest is already implemented in our data pipeline. So we wanted to present sort of an overview of this today. Again, I don't think we'll have time to step through an exact tutorial the same way that we did over the last day and a half. This is sort of our next steps, and in the future we might lead some tutorials on this, but hopefully what Fa shared is enough at least to get you started. So Fa, we have some time for questions.
Yeah.
And I know I haven't been following what's been going on in the chat, but we can see here. You guys have been following on the chat. Do you want to maybe chime in?
So what's the problem? Should everyone gap fill their own sites based on their own expertise and submit data, or how are we doing that?
So I think that's a great question. I guess we have some time now, so we can maybe think about this. You know, one thing we did last time for FLUXNet methane is that we standardized the gap filling. So it wasn't PI specific. It's sort of like running the MDS approach for CO2, right? Like PIs could run a random forest, could change predictor variables, but the FLUXNet data set is run with an MDS. I mean, I think this is something we can think about more, but I think there's value to both standardizing it and then having site PIs know their site better. I mean, there's always the option in ONEFlux for you to upload your own gap fill data, right? You can have it as underscore PI. So that's one option. I mean, I think, you know, we do that with our data when we upload to ONEFlux. You know, we include a PI variable where we've gap filled NEE, so like that a modeler can use it right away. My guess is we'll probably do some of our own standardizing for some of this for the FLUXNet methane V2 release, but PIs can always upload their own version. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on that.
How expensive is it to run different gap filling methods? Just for the sake of comparing performance at each site, so the PI can decide which one will be the best fit.
Yeah, you've been running, and Gavin, you've been running more of these models. I mean, do you have a thought? James' question here, like, you know, given the compute time to run all of these.
Yeah, Gavin, you want to go ahead? Oh, let me answer this.
Sure. I mean, I think the standardization was important. Work made sense for the first release. And it probably would continue to be important for like another data release version 2. But I think one take home from the analysis I was sharing is that the sites are all super different, and there is a menu of options that we provide in the code base, but there are also some other avenues maybe to improve the gap filling. You may be bringing in a different algorithm, and so I guess I'd imagined it could be great if we put this code base or others in the hands of PIs. They for their own benefit, you know, explore what is the best option at their site, maybe learn something, and then if somehow that information can be transferred when the data is submitted to the synthesis, it would enable some comparison, you know, between that kind of PI-led gap filling and the standard method. I do feel like in some of these cases, in most cases, the PI is going to be able to do a better job, especially if they're going through a procedure where they're comparing different predictor sets and they're comparing different algorithms and then arriving at a final decision themselves. Like with the standardized way, that will be too much compute time and analysis time. So you know, like you did, Sarah, you picked one solid way of doing it and went with that. So I guess both. I'm not sure if others have thoughts on that too, though.
Yeah, I'll add some comments on this kind of question. Yeah, in terms of computational time, like for the current data processing pipeline, if you want to quickly test the model performance on your data set, you just select, for example, the random cross validation. Can save lots of time, and also just try like random forest or ANN, this kind of method to quickly test the model performance on your site. If you want to like improve the accuracy, then the computing time will much higher because you need to try different predictors and also different kind of data sampling strategy to get an optimized like model performance. So yeah.
I mean, I guess throwing the question back to you, doing this global upscaling, what is like, if you had a wish list, what would it be?
I'm thinking about this from two perspectives. One is, I just assume I'm a site PI, I don't know anything about machine learning. But I know very well about my data set, assuming that I have some extreme values. So then Bob will be the person tell me, if you have a lot of extreme values, you probably don't want to use tree-based model, because that if you have enough depths, then it will overfit to those extreme values. But if I'm a PI, I don't have that issue, I have other issue. So someone will be responsible for telling the community, so these are the methods we provide, and I wanted to combine with your site knowledge to come up with the best solution. So it's not like it's just one-stop simple solution for this. Site has its own characteristics. And the second thing is, the tool is cool, right? But if I'm a site PI, I want to simplify as much this process as much as I can. So the ideal case will be, if I submit my data, you can just maybe cloud-based computing provide me these are the options for different gap filling methods, and this is just our first try, and to just show the performance, first try of performance, and then I will let you decide which method you will use and combine it with your site knowledge. So there will be a starting point, like we provide something, and they start to work on that.
Yeah, Gavin?
Sure. I had one follow-up there. I think I agree, Ching. I think yeah, there are some reasons why the PIs want to make it as straightforward as possible. I also think that the predictive model development and potential to actually query like variable importances of the models in the case of random forest means that there is insight that you learn something about what drives methane flux at the site by doing some of this. It's not primarily geared toward that, it's geared towards prediction, but there is some interpretation you can achieve from it. So I guess arriving at some broadly applicable conclusions, the best thing would be to have this workflow analysis performed as a much larger number of sites than the 17 that we compared. I think there has been a study since our publication that did extend that to some additional sites, but I felt like it's sort of an opportunity if PIs want to arrive at the best possible model to sort of encourage them and empower them to do that, and then we sort of like, it's essentially crowdsourcing a little bit that understanding of the we could then synthesize a much larger number of results. But it would, yeah, it is a extra step that's more time consuming than just saying gap fill and then going with one result. I don't know if there's a way we could help encourage or help facilitate PIs to do this essentially gap filling analysis of the models over and above just providing them the code base to do it.
Yeah, thanks, Gavin. I mean, I think this is, some of the details we'll get into like after the break. I think these are definitely good discussions to have. I mean, yeah, what's feasible, can ONEFlux, run multiple different gap filling approaches with multiple different, what's the compute power there and what's feasible and what's not. So I think that's a discussion that we'll do after the break. We'll have one more presentation before the break, and then we'll probably have a little bit of time. I think that presentation is scheduled for about 15 minutes, and we can revisit some of these questions as well, and then revisit them after the break as well. But I like all this discussion, and this is something that I know Gavin and I and others, we think about, what's the best way, how do we do this? So I look forward to that conversation. So our next presentation is going to be by Matt Fortier. Matt is, well, I'll let Matt, you can introduce yourself, and he'll sort of talk about some other approaches to machine learning and some new techniques that that have been developed. This field changes quite quickly. So up to you, Matt.
Perfect. Is my audio coming through okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Matthew.
Anyone else? Yeah, it's people mic again. Hey, Matt, we can't hear you in the room. Sorry. Oh, okay. Seems like we can't hear you.
Uh-oh.
Oh,
Zoom sometimes has issues with some Linux builds, so I will try to share screen one more time, but if it doesn't work, I could like during the break switch over to a Windows PC and then present after the break. So that's always an option. So I'll give this one more shot. All right, Zoom, please behave. I I think I'm okay.
can hear you.
Okay, good. So, yeah, as I said, I'm a data engineer at Oliver Sonnentag's lab at the University of Montreal. And today I'll be giving a brief overview of some experimental work I did during my master's degree at Polytechnique and the Mila Quebec AI Institute. My work focused mostly around leveraging advances in modern deep learning to better upscale carbon fluxes, though, as you'll see, the techniques can easily be applied to gap filling as well. I'm really glad that Gavin and Fa gave their talks before me because they provided a lot of relevant context that I wasn't able to fit into this presentation. So anyone familiar with the work coming out of FluxCom will know that modern data-driven carbon flux modeling can be performed bottom up using like site-level meteorological data supplemented by satellite imagery, typically MODIS for its high temporal frequency. This data is then usually crammed into a random forest or XGBoost or some other tabular machine learning algorithm. And the output of the model is compared to measured fluxes from a holdout set of the data like we discussed earlier, and then model parameters are adjusted accordingly. And we now know that this is a pretty effective technique, but there's a lot of room for improvement in this process. For example, we introduce quite a bit of information loss. First, if you're using satellite data, it's usually heavily compressed. Tabular machine learning algorithms are not well equipped to handle images, so it's common to use some kind of like weighted average system to compress each spectral band into a single value, and then those values are used as predictors. This it destroys all the spatial information contained in the image and results in an extremely coarse approximation of an already low resolution image. Additionally, this has been a big topic of discussion today. Like researchers will normally select a subset of variables with the highest predictive power to use in the model, using lasso regression or just domain knowledge or some other technique. And to be clear, this is the correct decision for this kind of algorithm, but I think that's more an indictment of the algorithms being used. Discarded variables can have significant information that's not being leveraged. Another area for improvement we identified was increasing model context windows. Current models treat carbon fluxes as Markovian over their predictor variables, or put another way, they're immediate estimators, which don't account for past conditions. And we know that that's not how biology works. Like if you have, a bunch of precipitation, it's going to affect the biological processes of that site. We wanted to change this by introducing context windows where each carbon flux prediction would be based on meteorological, soil, and satellite conditions from the previous T time steps. This provides a massive potential information gain for each inference step. So we had our problem identified. We want to improve our ability to model carbon fluxes from meteorological and satellite data by addressing information lost from compressed images and unused predictors, and potential information gain by showing the model a trend in each variable over time. Specifically, we were targeting that each time we want to predict a flux value, we'd feed it a few days worth of observations leading up to prediction time. So we're essentially increasing the data input to the model by several orders of magnitude. Most off-the-shelf machine learning models would have a lot of difficulty making sense of this much data. But luckily for us, the field of multimodal deep learning has had some breakthroughs in the past decade that we can take advantage of. So Much of modern deep learning is built on the idea of representation learning, or how we can use nonlinear transformations to change how data is represented so that its information can be better extracted and leveraged. The model that we built is based on perceiver architecture, which came out of Google DeepMind a few years ago, and we call our version eco-perceiver. I don't want to get too hung up on the implementation details, but let's get a high-level overview of how information flows through the model we made. So first, we create learned vectors for each time step. These are randomly initialized parameters of the model, and each vector will represent the ecosystem's state, in heavy quotation marks, at a particular time step with respect to the carbon fluxes. We call these latent arrays because they are in the model's latent space. They're not inputs, they're not outputs, they're just kind of how the model keeps track of it internally. We then encode all of the predictor variables, all the meteorological, all the satellite data into a big data block, one for each time step as well. For this illustration, time steps are colored differently, and in each encoded input block, each column is a transformed predictor, such as surface temperature, wind speed, or a flattened spectral band. The latent array at time t is relatively small, and we need to load it up with all of this information that's coming in from its respective time step. So we do this through an operation called cross-attention, where the latent array can identify what parts of the input are most important at runtime and utilize those parts. The latent array is projected onto a query space, while every part of the input array is projected to both a key space and a value space. These transformations are done using learned parameters. We multiply the query vector and the key vector to obtain the attention logits, which are then used to weight how important each input is. A weighted sum of value vectors are then used to update the latent array. This attention mechanism may be familiar to any of you who have experience with recurrent neural networks or transformers. It's the foundation of many modern deep learning architectures, and it helps a model to parse large amounts of data efficiently by identifying what is the most important, piece of data for me right now. After information is pulled from the inputs onto these latent arrays, we then let the latent arrays attend to each other in an operation called self-attention. It's the same idea as before, except every array can now attend to every other array, gathering information as necessary from previous time steps and updating their own states. As a side note, we usually enforce causality constraints so that each array is only looking into the past. The broad idea here is that every latent array first gathers information from the meteorological, soil, and satellite inputs, and it then gathers information from past states to further inform the present state. And then this process is repeated as the latent states refine themselves and then, ask different questions of the input and different questions of each other. This is an overview of the entire model architecture. It's a lot to look at. I'm really sorry. And if anyone is interested in learning more about it, I'll link to our paper at the end. But I wanted to just use it to highlight what goes in and what comes out. You can see the tabular input, the meteorological data, and the remote sensing data go into the model on the left, and they get encoded so that they're in the same projection space, and they're combined into that encoded input block you see in white. Underneath, the latent arrays are shown in purple. These are funneled into a set of cross-attention blocks and a set of self-attention blocks before a linear projection layer pulls the flux value out of the latent space. There's also another input important to our discussion called the modality mask. And this is a binary mask indicating missing input values. One of the advantages of this style of model is that it's extremely robust to missing inputs. If a sensor reading is missing or no satellite imagery was taken, we can simply use the modality mask to just zero out the attention scores for that input vector. We even go a step further, and during training, we artificially mask out random inputs to teach this model to estimate fluxes with sparser information. This doesn't mean it does better with less information, but rather that the model just learns not to rely too heavily on any one particular input modality. So we have a model which can take in multimodal data, images, tabular data. It can even take in like audio or LiDAR or what have you, without any kind of compression. We use data in a large context window to capture temporal trends, and it's robust to missing inputs. So it's natural then to ask, how does it perform? We compared the performance of eco-perceiver to an XGBoost model trained with the same regime as Fluxcom's recent XBase model. The training and testing were done on site-level data from FLUXNET, ONEFlux, and ICOS releases. And in total, we had over 27 million site hours in our data set from 385 eddy covariance sites worldwide. EcoPerceiver outperformed XGBoost in the vast majority of ecosystem types. So you can see the IGBP column kind of on the side there. The only exceptions were extremely close, like the water ecosystem where all models were kind of a, you know, it was a crapshoot. They didn't do very well. And for all of these tests, we've included pairwise t-tests to show just how robust the results are. EcoPerceiver really does like consistently outperform these tabular methods. And you would expect as much because it's getting a lot more information. So what about methane? These experiments were all performed using net ecosystem exchange as the target flux, but EcoPerceiver can be very easily adapted to work with methane as a target. You can even decide to use it to gap fill other like meteorological data. It is completely agnostic to what you're trying to pull out of the latent space. And recall that we didn't attempt to identify a subset of variables specific to net ecosystem exchange. It excels at figuring out the relevant information all on its own. That is one of the great advantages of modern deep learning. I hypothesize that this will remain true with methane to some extent, and last week I was starting to refactor my data pipeline to prepare FLUXNET-CH4 community data to test this, but it's not quite there yet. Now, this method is not without its fair share of limitations. Training this model was a significant undertaking. The algorithm works best on GPUs, so it was trained on a compute cluster and took about 12 hours to complete training. It doesn't provide any uncertainty quantification at this time. That's not to say it's impossible, but it was not scoped for the initial effort. The algorithm works best when it has a large amount of training data from a diverse set of sites. This means that if one were using it for gap filling, it would be trained on many other sites first before then being refined on the target site. Very different from some of the methods that we've seen before where they just need the site that you're using. And finally, the testing was all done with fully released data, which had already been through the ONEFlux pipeline. It wasn't tested on raw data because I don't have large quantities of raw data to test it on. But I did remove like almost all gap-filled data from the FluxNet release. So what have we learned here? We can create a large neural network that ingests a massive amount of information, has a large compute time, and requires that we pull satellite data for our eddy covariance sites in order to have slightly better inference capabilities. I think it's normal at this point to ask, does modern deep learning have a place here? I would argue yes, but it's important to temper that response with the knowledge that this is just one more tool in the toolbox. There are trade-offs to be made here. The model has higher functional capacity and thus better potential inference power, irrespective of how well that power is being realized right now. I am, alas, but one human. But this power is juxtaposed with lower explainability and both of the model's uncertainty and the importance of each output, which, as discussed this morning, you can get from things like random forests very easily. Also, this model has much higher flexibility in its information sources. You got phenocam images, it can take that and it'll improve the results. Got LiDAR readings, no problem. You can throw literally anything at it. However, this flexibility may be held back by the model being more difficult to set up and train. For now, it still pretty much needs an engineer to use it at its full potential. So before this model or any others like it will ever be fully embraced by the community, we need to tip the scales of these trade-offs. The model's inference power is only going to grow as we acquire more usable data to train it. In deep learning, we'll train flexible models on mountains of data to the point where they can generalize to new distributions really easily. These are called foundation models. The longer we collect eddy covariance data, the closer we can get to that point with deep learning models here. Explainability is going to be a bit tougher to address, but this is something that has been explored with other deep learning frameworks. Iterating on this model to produce valid uncertainty estimates will make it a lot more palatable to researchers in the natural sciences. And finally, if we can increase this model's accessibility by making it, usable via an API or a very accessible library, it'll be much easier to incorporate it into pipelines like FluxNet-CH4. And that is all I had for you today. I know that's a lot. This is a really modern deep learning is pretty far removed from a lot of the domains that it's often applied to. So it is normal for you to have a lot of concerns, things that I have not addressed. I do not come from a geoscience background, so I'm still learning about these things, constraints that are really important to these scientists and then trying to incorporate that into these frameworks. But yeah, I'm happy to take any questions and kind of provide a bit more context here.
All right, wonderful. Thanks, Matt. So we had a couple questions. Any questions online? Or was that more, those were previous? Well, we have some time for questions, either in the room or online.
No pressure.
I have a question. So you mentioned that a lot of these that a lot of the data sets that you used all the data that was available in order to train this sort of I guess gap filling or modeling. And did you find that it was ever, I guess, the opposite of overfitting? Like we talked about, like individual sites tend to perform best when there's a long record at that particular site, but because the sites are so diverse, do you notice any kind of decline in performance when you use all data available?
No, actually, this is the really interesting thing. The generalizability goes up the more diverse the training data set with models this size. So we did an experiment where we only trained it on, I think it was evergreen needle leaf forests. So we excluded all other data and just focused on that, which would have, a bit more of a consistent distribution, even though they can still be quite diverse. And it performed worse. It performs a lot better if it's able to learn from all of these different conditions. And I think part of that is that you're conditioning the model on this satellite data, which gives a lot of additional information about what that ecosystem looks like. So as you provide a more diverse set of like images to it, correlated with like different distributions in the carbon fluxes, it starts to learn those relationships better. That's the idea anyway.
And I see that Gavin had a question.
Yeah, I have one quick comment and then a question. Just from the predictive modeling work on the eddy covariance time series I've done before, we noticed that as soon as even a small fragment of a particular site's time series is introduced into a predictive model, the model is able to very, very quickly, with very few observations, essentially very little model bleed, reproduce the time series at that site in a like remarkably more accurate way than if it's truly extrapolating to that entirely new time series condition. So that's just like one thought in terms of like I wasn't quite sure how you were dividing your data up into test, train validation and test. And maybe I'll let you respond to that first. Before.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. So because we were operating on such a large amount of data, we actually split it up by sites. So we held out entire sites as validation, entire sites as test. And it performed like quite well on sites where it didn't have any information about that site. Actually, okay. Again, I'll try to share my screen without breaking Zoom. I really should just switch to Windows in the future when I'm on calls. So as an example, like this is like an image of a site that was totally in the test set. So it had not seen it at all. And it's able to just follow the fluxes pretty well. So was the XGBoost, actually. It may be just a consequence of training with this much data. This was GF Guy, which I think is an evergreen, deciduous evergreen broadleaf. That's what it is. And then down here we had like a pine beetle ravaged evergreen needle leaf in British Columbia, where both models had a lot more trouble. So I guess the point that I'm getting at is like it doesn't even matter if you leave an entire site out, it's never trained on any samples from that site. It still tends to do quite well because you've just thrown so much data at it.
Yeah, that's really neat, and I think in a way you're getting at the fact that the predictive work that we might do, what in my talk I was really just looking at one site and imputing one time series, and that's sort of I think how we thought about gap filling. But like I actually thinking more about the distinctions or similarities in the problem of gap filling a particular time series versus effectively extrapolating to an entirely new site, which I think we've thought about in terms of upscaling. or spatial extrapolation. There's some overlap there, and I think conversations between those two efforts could help. Like it sounds like what you're doing is sort of spanning a bit of both.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a comment earlier in the chat about what to do with really long gaps, like over a winter where the power goes out or something. That is a situation where if you've got a model that's seen many different sites before, then it has a little bit more to go on for like a massive missing chunk. Because if you have like a year that you're trying to gap fill and you're missing an entire season, your model isn't going to have much reference point for what the distribution is going to look like for that season. Whereas if it's seen all of these like different sites before, and it also has this auxiliary data, this satellite data or phenocams coming in, you're giving it more to work with, and so it's better at addressing those long gaps, I think. There's also there's a few questions I saw in the chat about like overfitting. It was really weird when I started like learning about these like really large models. Overfitting starts to become less and less of a concern as you're scaling data up this size. Because even if you're only holding out like 5% of your data, it's like millions and millions of samples across dozens of sites. And so you do get like a really solid estimate of performance. But that being said, we did still hold out like 10 to 15% of the sites, I think. Yeah, something like that.
Thanks for that. And there was another question about what remote sensing products did you use?
Oh, I used MCD 43A2 and 43A4. I think they're both coming out of University of Boston. They're derived products from Modis. So they simulate like nadir cloudless images by using like a moving 16-day window, I think.
Okay, great, thanks. I had another quick question, and then we might have time for one more before the break. But so I noticed, NEE is a little bit more predictable than methane fluxes. Also, your
Yeah.
NEE performed least well on wetlands and open water, which is where most of the methane is from. I was wondering what your thoughts were on like methane that's, less predictable, more episodic, more lagged, nonlinear. What are your thoughts on that?
So first of all, I think that incorporating time series data is definitely going to help with that because like if it's got a lot of um, like time dependent factors, I think it'll just be easier for the model to ingest all of that data and try and make a more informed prediction. But the truth is like this is deep learning has become one of those fields where it's less theoretical and more just kind of trying things and seeing how it works. So that would be my answer for now is like the only thing we could do is try to see if it's see if it ends up doing a better job. I did notice like in the preliminary work I've done with the methane products that yeah, the fluxes are a lot more erratic, to say the least. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I think it'll have good predictive power, but that's why I don't want to market this as a panacea yet.
Right. Okay. Great. Thanks, Matt. So I was just looking at the schedule. I realized we don't actually have a break, but let's take a 10-minute break, just so that folks can, let's take a 15-minute break, a little bio break here. We'll reconvene at 10:15 Pacific time, and then we're going to have a discussion. We're going to loop in, folks from AMP, folks from ICOS. And this is really an opportunity for us to have a discussion as a community. So yeah, I encourage people to turn on their screens if they would like. And this is more of a conversation on, how do we incorporate this into ONEFlux? So yeah, with that, we're gonna go ahead and pause for 15 minutes and we'll come back in 15 minutes. Thanks. Welcome to our last session here. So let me just stop sharing my screen. And this is our opportunity for conversations amongst ourselves. Dario, we don't want a FLUXNet methane version 3. So how do we make that happen? So I'll let Dario and Gilberto and Gavin and myself, we can sort of lead this discussion and have a conversation. So people can weigh in if you want to turn on your cameras. That's exciting. Otherwise, you can just weigh in. So I don't know who wants to kick us off here with some thoughts. Dario, yes.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I could not participate to the first part because I had an ICOS meeting, and I'm also still at the university. So I have 10 minutes and then I have to move. Then I will be in the car trying to listen to the discussion. However, Gilberto, I hope will be connected until a point, let's say, because he's also in Italy. But let me just give an introduction to the point so that we can let's say, can be the basis of the of the discussion. As you probably know, ONEFlux it's a common code that we developed together across networks that is now used by ICOS, but is used also by ONEFlux, is going to be implemented, is under implementation in Australia, will be so for ONEFlux will be also the next the software used for the future release of the FLUXNet data. And I just put in the chat the link to the just if you don't know it, on the GitHub on the current version. Gilberto is visiting us now for the next 6 weeks. And we are also working on improvements in ONEFlux. That, however, is still basically carbon, CO2, energy, and meteo. My idea and the point is that we need to really try to take the maximum, take the maximum advantage possible from the experience in this project in order to understand and evaluate carefully what to implement in the new version of ONEFlux that we can imagine to be implemented at the end of FLUXNet methane version 2, so that we have something consolidated. There is some just to give some idea at the beginning. I mean, there is something that guided the development of ONEFlux. One of the key points was that must be something manageable and applicable. What does it mean? That we try, that we try always to find a compromise between the best that we can and something that can be standardized. We know, and I think we all agree that that the standardization is never the best option for a single site. Each site is unique. For each site, there are specific things that you would do differently to be really perfect. However, we have to find a compromise, and ONEFlux, like also FLUXNet Methane, has the idea to say, can we find something that is a good compromise, the maximum quality possible on something that is comparable? Now, in order to achieve this, what is needed is that whatever we implement in a common software must be something that in general can work in the majority of sites. We don't implement in ONEFlux something that really needs specific condition that at the end you can apply in 10 sites out of 500. That's not a goal. The goal is to really try always to implement things that are general enough, and so if you want, easy enough. Easy in terms of requirements of data and metadata, and also somehow easy in terms of implementing and running them. Always try to find a good compromise between the two aspects. Just to give you an example, in a version of before the FLUXNet 2015, so before ONEFlux, there was another collection of FLUXNet named the Latuil 2008. In this Latuil 2008, there was a gap filling made by two different methods. It was the neural network and the MDS. And then in the new one, there is only the MDS. And the reason is that at the end, the effort to have the neural network gap filling at the end was statistically not paying back in terms of accuracy of the gap filling respect to the MDS. Was only doing this if the gaps were really super long, but then the question was, okay, are we becoming modelers? Because if the gap is 3 months, then it's better a model probably than the ecological model that you parameterize with the site data. And so this was the decision. So we went in the direction of a easier technique because statistically it was not justified to invest a lot in implementing in Python or in whatever at that time. Now maybe it would be easier, but all this neural network, but not only the neural network, also the splitting, the training, the validation, the uncertainty, and everything. So my request, let's say, to Sara and all the group leading the FLUXNet Methane is to always kind of keep, in addition to everything that you will do for the implementation in ONEFlux, is always to keep kind of this line and try to select, we will work, we help on this, select which are the steps that we think, yes, they are important, they should be applied to all the sites, they should work in all the sites, except few, that's fine. If in few cannot be applied, that's fine. That will increase the quality. Maybe it's not the best option for all of the sites, however, it's a good compromise. And the effort and the technical difficulties to implement them is justified, but really the improvement of performance respect to easiest solutions. I would say that this should be the guideline, and my idea would be that at the end of the FLUXNet Methane, we will have a suite of options that we can evaluate and discuss together and say what to implement, what not. And then that will be relatively easy, because nowadays nobody is really, I hope, I see finally that we discussed it at the ONEFlux meeting, and I hope that nobody is implementing things in Excel. Now everybody are kind of coding, so whatever you implement will be relatively easy to say, okay, let's reshape a little bit and add to the pipeline. Of course, but there must be a kind of a general way to implement it, so must be general enough. But it's something that is easier respect to starting from something done in Excel that you have to translate in something that can work in all the sites. So that will be my start of the discussion, or my, let's say, expectation of the FLUXNet Methane version 2 toward the implementation of the results in ONEFlux. So the next time we just run ONEFlux also with all the methane. And so the next project, Sara, will be FLUXNet N2O that we have to start with at one point. That is different from methane. I mean, what we saw for the methane would not be, I mean, the gut feeling is completely different. The filtering is completely, the dynamic of the flux is completely different. So we require, yes, an effort, but I'm sure that also Robert will be happy, because Global Carbon Project is also extended to N2O, and they have at least one report on N2O. I don't know if there is another one coming. So N2O is officially recognized as an important component. So let's see what will happen.
Thanks,
So
Dario.
this will be my introduction. And then, as I said, I will now disconnect and then reconnect from the car and listen to your discussion and maybe participate if I say I'm safe driving. Okay.
Sounds good. Thanks, Dario. Yeah, that was a good introduction. And Gilberto, we can chat a little bit more, but I guess one question we had, obviously there's always a nice trade-off between, simplicity or, complexity, applicability, computational resources, and I think one thing we've seen is that, going from ANNs to random forest to XGBoost to EcoPerceiver, there are some gains, but the gains aren't tremendous. So I guess the question is, like, what could ONEFlux do? Like, is random forest or some sort of neural network approach feasible, or do you guys want to stay away from that?
I guess this is for me. Yeah, this is a great question, Sara, and we've been working a lot to gauge what can be done in terms of feasibility, and so far we haven't really hit a wall in terms of limitations for computation. So that are venues that we can explore to run some of these more these models that are heavier in computation, and including clusters that are GPU based and all that. I was excited to see some of the results in the presentations earlier today. So I guess from that perspective, of course, we can't be just optimistic, and we have to take a look at the actual costs and do the math. But the math is simple for that. But we haven't hit that wall yet. Our bottlenecks, honestly, are to gather the time that is needed to gather all the metadata and all the configuration for running the sites. And you have this experience firsthand with these two collections. This is something that takes a massive effort. And but once the site teams get on board and they get used to the format and they kind of get in the rhythm of using these formats to send the data into the networks, this becomes a much smoother process. So that's one of the main reasons why we managed with the CO2, water, and energy pipeline, why we managed to go from about 80 sites to more than 600 sites in 10 years. So this is a pretty big jump. So I'm naturally optimistic, but I will say that from the computational cost side, I don't think we've hit that barrier yet. And we do have options of trying to convince program managers that this is important and getting them on board to support allocating more computational resources. Well, DOE has some pretty good resources from the computation side. So I guess that part is not so much of an issue, but figuring out the models for data ingestion, for getting the data from the site teams to the networks in a way that can work is really important. And the other side of the coin is very important too, right? How these data are being used. So the aspect of being able to generate a uniform product is not just for the sake of simplicity and how we run the codes and how we run the pipelines, but it's also important for how people are using this data. If you're running comparisons across sites, across many sites, it is important that they were processed consistently. And so if we are running multiple methods, for instance, this is something that came up earlier, we need to establish a good characterization of how the methods are selected to end up in the final product. So when people are comparing two sites or many sites, they actually know that the data that are being compared, they are comparable. They have some assurance that that is a reasonable thing to do, right? Otherwise, it reduces the value of the data products for synthesis analysis, for any validation of more complex products from remote sensing to models. So this is an important aspect, and not just from the point of view of cost to run, but also from the end user, how these data sets are being used. Maybe I ran too long with the question. Just a little bit of an overview of how I approach this.
Great, thanks, Gilberto. Yeah, I'll address the part of getting the data to the network, and then others can weigh in on sort of approaches. Yeah, so what we've done over the last day and a half is provide additional code to help people get data into the networks. I know people have their own ways, that's fantastic. But if you're looking for some assistance on getting your data to the networks, that's what we've spent the last day and a half doing. I know many of you, have sat through that. So hopefully that helps address, part of that challenge. So there's code and resources. Maybe Rosie, you could share the link to the data pipeline for those that didn't attend that. So that's one way to get the data there. And then for the other half related to approaches and methods, I'll open that up for discussion.
If I can just chime in, I was excited about the something that was raised before. I'll just mention that briefly. I think it was Gavin or maybe Matt who mentioned this idea of kind of a collective experiment where people are contributing their own results to help evaluate the methods. That sounds exciting. It's much harder to coordinate than one might think, but it is something that would be really cool to explore. Something like this. It doesn't necessarily have to be super distributed, but it might be a good idea to coordinate an experiment like that, a collective experiment.
Thanks, Roberto. Kyle, you had your hand up?
Just a clarifying question. question. So Gilberto, you mentioned that, how it's a heavy lift to get all the data that are necessary to bring in the methane to gap fill it. But I'm wondering how much, if somebody is submitting data to ONEFlux for, CO2 and water, what additional variables are needed for methane specifically in terms of the gap fill? Like how much extra work is it?
That's a great question. I can try to make an educated guess here. Until we really start running, it's really hard to predict. There are always lots of surprises. But in general terms, I would expect that main challenges would be resolved. Someone that's used to the pipeline for CO2, they would not find the additional variables or the additional quality control or any of these steps that happen before we do the processing. They would not find that terribly different. That's my expectation. I think it would be pretty similar. Getting on board with the first getting on board with for the first time with the whole process is probably the most challenging part. There is a ramp up period that is a little steep in some cases, but after that, it's usually just getting the format right, getting the format of the metadata right, that sort of thing. So I would suspect that it should be very similar.
Yeah, I mean, in FLUXNet methane 1, we went with a set of predictors that were common across all sites. And then that's a discussion that we can have here, right? Like, can you just sort of throw the kitchen sink at it? Or like, do we just go with a set of predictors? I mean, it seemed like some marginal gains, but yeah, I'll stop there. Gavin, you've had your hand up.
Yeah, I'm going back a little bit to Gilberto's point about the scientific purpose of an interest of the end user for the final standardized product versus kind of the steps that take you to that during the pipeline. And I guess is it right to think that most end users want to work with a fully gap filled product? If methane is added as a variable, most people are working with the gap filled data, and I could imagine there's some cases where people might still want to do a synthesis study, but maybe want to stick to non-gap fill values just out of some caution about the quality of the gap filling. And if people are using the gap filled data, am I right in understanding what you were saying, Gilberto, is that as soon as you have like two methods, two gap filled variables, two different methods, it raises a question about it kind of implicitly raises a question about is the gap filling that good? Why are there two methods? Why is there not just one? And I'm guessing that most people don't. It's already complicated enough to do synthesis work across multiple sites, and the types of questions you can ask are really exciting. So I imagine if suddenly like you present an analysis and you have one result that's from this column and one result from another, is that kind of what you were getting at? That it's really not the type of science. Like it would be better to have established maybe do science at the PI to bottom up compilation level that lines up with individual PI's interests and learning about their sites and what works. And then it's like what goes into the ONEFlux pipeline is really like the most defendable approach that gives one variable.
Yeah, I'll comment briefly here. I think from the point of view of how people are using the data, I can't give you very good statistics on preference for using gap fill or no gap fill. I think there are very good applications on both sides. Mostly people that are using aggregated data. So if you're going through a daily, monthly, yearly resolution, the only way to do that kind of reliably is through gap fill data, right? You can't really get around that aspect if you're going at these temporal scales. But there are many applications that are dependent on not having any type of model behind the data. They really want the actual observation so they can have trust in what they're using. And those are all over the place too. There are many of those applications that are important and people use the data that way. From the point of view of comparing methods or having multiple methods, what has guided us to add multiple methods into the pipeline, we have a couple of steps that have more than one method implemented, is generally situations that one method will address better than a different method, right? So in the case of the flux partitioning, for instance, there are many sites that have very stable conditions through the night. So it's not a fair assumption to say that the nighttime fluxes really represent a respiration 100% for the site. So for those sites, having the daytime method as an alternative is super important. At the same time, there are sites where the radiation is not driving radiation and humidity. They are not driving the GPP in a very clean way. So you can't really just rely on the daytime method. So there are these choices, right? So in situations like this, it is important to have the additional methods. And you're right, it does create quite a bit of confusion. And how do you, for an end user, what do you pick as what you're going to use? This is probably what we hear the most as criticism for the FLUXNet product that is being produced. And what you were suggesting earlier, I think, kind of figuring out how to combine these and maybe generate a combined result, an ensemble type approach for these multiple methods is something that we've been trying to explore and see if that's reasonable. We do that actually for the U-star filtering step, for instance. We combine the two methods and propagate the results. So for other methods, like gap filling or flux partitioning, it is an interesting problem. It is a challenging problem to understand how you could combine these things. Now, the last part of your question, if I'm understanding this right, is about getting what is the most representative or the best result for each site, trying to get that through for synthesis analysis. To be honest, I'm not sure how well that would work. This is something that we would have to try and compare. I know a few people tried to do comparisons of respiration and GPP, comparing what the PIs provide and what the standard product generates. I don't remember seeing huge differences when you take into account the global data sets for individual sites. That may be, the differences may be significant, but or if you take into account the whole, it's not that different. So it's something that is interesting. We should explore more, and but I'm just not sure how to go about that.
Great, thanks, Gilberto. Thanks, Gavin. Joe, you had your hand up.
Yeah, getting at this question you were asked about, do people want the gap fill data more than they want just the raw data? One of the questions we field a lot of the times is people have downloaded the ONEFlux product and can't find something or are doing some analysis where they aren't supposed to be using gap filled and don't realize that there are two products. And so that we end up having to point them towards the ONEFlux base and say, hey, go get this other set of data because this is the ungap filled version, or it has the some other variable that's not accepted into FLUXNet, like salinity or something strange, or even water tables. I think somebody was asking for, where's the water table? So the point is that, I think in choosing a standardized method to do this global gap filling is great. And for all the reasons that Dario put in there about being practical about it and being cross-wise is great. But realize that when that product is available, that's sort of the default product that people will go and get, and that they do not, in my experience, go to the ONEFlux base set anymore and get sort of the set that they feel is less polished, which in some cases could be better. And I guess the other point I wanted to make is that Matt's presentation with that massive machine learning system that takes everything into account, that is something I see that, something like FluxNet or AmeriFlux in the future could move towards, where they've got all that data already. They're doing cutouts for MODIS, they're doing cutouts for a bunch of the other satellites. That's not something that, as I feel, as individual PIs will be able to handle on their own. And so, going forward, yes, you need to come up with something that's going to plug into ONEFlux to give us some gap fill data next year. Beyond that, the next version of it, I think, some of those massive machine learning things that can learn from all the sites, and Dario's point of how do you gap fill 3 months? Maybe that's one way to do it.
Great, thanks, Joe.
If I can fit just a very quick comment. So the non-gap fill data is available in the FluxNet product. You just have to use the quality flags. And I know this adds a step, but it is there.
It's apparently beyond a lot of people, because most of the questions we get about our data from people using it is, where's the non-gap filled stuff? Or they don't even realize that it exists. So they've just gone and done some analysis with the gap filled stuff that you probably shouldn't have used. And the other thing is, is there no FC variable in the FluxNet? There's only NEE.
We are working on incorporating a few more of these variables in the standard output for the next versions. But that's right. And even the original NEE is not in there. This is something that people request a lot too. So we are adding those.
So there are some things missing.
Are you guys going to output all the new MET variables as well, like DO and those kinds of things in the ONEFlux?
Yeah, we're discussing that. One thing that we will likely do to have this be available in kind of not so and not have to wait so long is to output these variables just directly without doing the gap filling for the variables. So they would be available directly. And we are working on making the gap filling methods more parameterizable as well for other reasons, but it will serve this purpose as well. So we can select the drivers in a more flexible way to gap fill these other variables. We are experimenting with that. Yes. Hopefully this will not take too long to be available. The variables, just the variables themselves, I'm pretty sure it will be quick, but the gap filled with the dynamic drivers will have to do a little bit more work.
Great, thanks. Any other thoughts, comments? Yeah. You got one here. I can't turn my camera on the topic of comparability. There's a critical moment of code and data where we need to continue to focus on making methods open, interoperable, and comparable before adding functionality. Betsy, can you turn on your mic? Oh, no, you can't turn your mic on. Okay, sorry, I just I mean, thanks for that thought. I think some of what we tried to do in this workshop is to at least provide a bit more guidance on how to use the open source code. So whether that's the tutorials from yesterday or FA's tutorial from today, just making it easier for the user to use. So adding more documentation, making that code available. I really like the AmeriFlux resource that lists all the code available for data wrangling. I think that's a really nice first step. But if folks have other thoughts or ideas on, what else you would like to see, there are the FluxNet committees, and one of them is on open science and open data. Or you can check, post more here and we can incorporate that. Anyone else have thoughts on Betsy's comment? So I guess, Gilberto, I sort of put you on the spot here, but you're our ONEFlux person, so it's good to have the opportunity to chat with you. What would you like to see from us from FluxNet Methane version 2 that would be most helpful to get methane into ONEFlux?
that's a great question, Sarah. And one thing that might be on your radar, but maybe not, is keeping track of the things that gave you trouble, right? So the problems that are usually solved kind of in the back end of things, where you're not really, okay, there's a problem here, I'll just resolve it this way and move forward. Those types of problems will trip us as well, very likely. So knowing about some of these things that you encountered that are usually not material that you choose to publish, right? It's not science, it's not really engineering, it's more kind of troubleshooting. Those kinds of things we don't keep track too much normally. So if there's anything that you can generate in terms of kind of figuring out details for sites that have specific conditions, for instance, that you had to do some tweaking of the data or tweaking of the algorithms, things like that should be very useful. Those are the kinds of things that really, sometimes it's a minor thing and takes days to resolve. And of course, this is something that you are already doing. The other thing that takes a lot of time is testing the code on a wide range of sites. But in this case, you are already doing that. You're not only doing the evaluation, you're actually doing the data. So those are the two main things that I think would be helpful in getting the code integrated and getting the functionality integrated, right? Making things play well together. And keeping the format. Go ahead.
Yeah, Dario?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so two additional points. One is that for the methane in particular, it's really critical how you move from the raw data to the fluxes. And I would say I strongly suggest you to collect this type of information. I mean, methane fluxes makes completely different story if it's an open path or a closed path Picardo. And in the open path, how you implemented the WPL correction, which is the effect, and if you hit the sonic anemometer or not, and so on. So my suggestion is take this information. These are crucial to better understand, and it's the right time to collect them. And second is, for all the variables that Joe was also referring to, how do you generally do the gap filling of dissolved or oxygen? How do you generally do the gap filling of variables that are really peculiar? Which are the drivers that you use? So that's these are all things that would be very important, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, gap filling the drivers like DO or water table depth. I mean, that's a big reason why we didn't use them in version 1 was, if you're at a cold site, half the time you don't have water table depth in the winter, or, your sensors break and they're very sensitive. So, I think that's why we went with sort of a cross-site availability of data. But I don't know, maybe Matt or Fa have some ideas on how you can use snippets of just those data to train models, so you don't actually need to gap fill the incoming metadata.
Yeah, that's good. But just to be clear, it would be nice since you are putting together a community to know what the community is also doing, because maybe from what the single people are doing, we can organize a system that is filling gaps of also these variables, where at the moment I would not know how to do the gap filling of water table depth. Unless you have a redundancy in the sensor, I don't know how to fill the gaps of this variable.
Right, yeah, okay, that's a good point. We'll keep that in mind in our discussions.
With
Matt?
variables like that may not be present at a large amount of sites, that's one place where even with the deep learning methods being really robust to missing inputs, if there's something that's only present in like 10% of samples, it does become very difficult to pull any predictive information out of it.
Yeah, for this kind of grid point, it's a really important point for the tropical area. Like for the tropical, the water really important a lot, but in lots of sites, the water table depths and soil water content, this kind of variable are missing. And also even for the ER5, it has huge uncertainty. So maybe we can consider about other like microwave remote sensing, this kind of band information to help us do the gap filling or understand dynamics of this kind of methane sites over this kind of like tropical sites or the sites of water really important. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, Fa and Matt maybe, and all the others in the room who are, especially tropical PIs, maybe that's something we can, focus on a little bit in this version is hopefully we will have more tropical sites. So maybe we could see what additional remote sensing products we could use and how that could improve gap filling. So we don't actually, necessarily need the direct observations if they're not available. Okay, I saw a couple hands go up. Housen and then Gavin.
I saw Gavin have a hand first.
Oh, sorry, Gavin.
Thanks, Housen. Yeah, I wanted to think a little bit about the overarching goals of the second data product, and we talked about that shift to the tropics, and so I think one thing there that's relevant is the seasonally dynamic wetland systems, where this moisture limitation really drives a lot of the biology, biogeochemistry, and so I think that that's been said just before, but I think that cuts across with outside of the tropics. There's also upland sites where we really focused everything on wetlands in FLUXNet-Methane version 1, and a lot of the analyses were focused on that. But as soon as you step out of that into upland systems, looking at the methane fluxes there, in a sense, they're the dry season of a seasonal wetland elsewhere. And so I just like the idea of, I feel like to really apply a gap filling procedure and understand its performance across the full FLUXNet-Methane version 2 data set, there could be kind of ways to branch out from what we've done with wetlands to think about maybe tropical wetlands or seasonally dynamic systems, or maybe we're missing hydrology, but we can do something with satellites. And then also thinking about less common but growing coverage in uplands sites, and the sort of whether we can or cannot detect uptake and the dynamics of that. So I just wanted to build on that thought about the tropical, and maybe just to reiterate that, I think part of the purpose of demonstrating the fast great walkthrough of the code base today is that it's not perfect, but it is modular and flexible. And so if we can put this in the hands of people who have data and want to contribute it to FLUXNet-Methane version 2, maybe that lends itself to a sort of a synthesis of results, where we can kind of naturally extend what we did in Jeremy Irvin's paper to a larger number of sites fairly naturally without a whole lot of extra facilitation.
Great, thanks, Gavin. Housen.
Sure. A couple comment, maybe suggestion, I think. So one thing we learned by working with the previous version of FLUXNet-Methane would be, that's something we are pretty good at, right? So ONEFlux management project, we're pretty good in terms of building a pipeline to do something like that in a scaling up way. But also, on the other hand, we're pretty bad in terms of communication, and that's usually what things fall apart, right? So you have a lot of sites, and they might be new to the community, and they are learning. So I hope we can still work together to bridge this gap. I know a lot of sites, they're new. They don't understand about all the format requirement and what it takes to get into the data. So I think there still needs some interface or someone be willing to step up and do this kind of thing. I think that's still important, especially we're talking about tropical site. I think they have even more barrier, to accomplish. I want to get back to, there are also some other thing we need to consider, especially ONEFlux. Not just code, but also the like a data policy, or what is the requirement to be able to use a service like this, right? So we moved to an open policy a couple of years ago. So we only process a site they kind of adapt to this policy. So something to consider. So when we are talking about this service, not just code, but also are people willing to adapt to this new policy and be part of this? So that's my comment.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I can talk on both of those just quickly, and then others can weigh in. Particularly, we do want to hear from folks that are either newer to these efforts or maybe, particularly in underrepresented regions. I mean, yeah, one of our big efforts, partly through this workshop, partly through the MORE project and an upcoming Powell workshop, is to sort of work more closely with research groups that maybe, historically haven't had enough support to get these data online. So that's why we've been, working on these data tutorials. We're going to have some workshops with folks from across the tropics, so a Powell workshop and others, where we can work on data wrangling. Part of why I developed all of this was I know how much work it is, and it takes time and effort. And so if there's standardized ways of doing this, then it's a lot easier for everyone. I don't know, it makes my life immensely easier, and I know others have similar tools. So that's why I wanted to sort of share those. And then in terms of the data policy, yeah, that's something that I think is a really important issue, something that we spend a lot of time thinking about. I mean, I think I spent a good couple of years, thinking about that for version 1 and version 2. For version 2, we've agreed that, all the CO2 needs to be open. That's a requirement. And for the methane, we've explored some potential embargoes, but we really want to be able to connect with the PIs to understand the need for those, methane embargoes. As you mentioned, it is a service we provide to have this gap fill data. So to benefit, from PIs receiving that gap fill data, there has to be some sort of give and take as well. So making data available. On the other hand, I know how much, work and effort it is across sites, especially regions where getting scientific funding or sites up and going are experience greater challenges. But yeah, and also, one thing that we've made clear in FLUXNet methane is that we're not doing any site level analyses, right? So if this data is made publicly available, we're working on synthesis products, and for the first 3 papers, we invite co-authors as another incentive to share data. But we're not focused on site level papers that we know belongs to the site PIs who've put their blood, sweat, and tears into that data. So yeah, but I do agree that these conversations are really, really important, and I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on either of those points. Yeah, Gavin?
Yeah, just building off Hassan and your comments there about the effort involved in the data wrangling and the preparation for submission, even to the first into the regional networks, AmeriFlux and EuroFlux. It's not trivial, and it's a bottleneck for PIs around the world, and for us for compiling data. Maybe there's a way to line up with that, with the fact that Hassan just shared that one of the strengths of AmeriFlux is all that they've invested and the skill they have in the infrastructure and skill they have in facilitating data submissions and to both the format and data QA QC, that whole pipeline. I'm wondering if those things could be lined up. And I just went through as a new PI, I just went through my first site data submission. First with the format, and then now through the data QC QA with AmeriFlux. And it seems like at that point, if there was a way to invite participation in a methane gap filling kind of synthesis or experiment, perhaps there could be one extra component added where they can provide a gap filled methane column using maybe using our code base, and maybe people from the FLUXNet methane activity can kind of leads or co-leads or other participants could help the PIs with that extra data variable. So I guess the reason I'm stressing that is that then it's bringing those extra resources in line with the point at which there's already a bottleneck, where the PI is getting that data ready to submit. I've been trying to find these synergies in other ways throughout the data processing pipelines, but I wondered about that.
I mean, PIs can submit their own gap fill data. I mean, we do. I think we use like an underscore PI or something.
Yeah, I think the idea is that it would be more of a formal addition. So they could opt in to participate in sort of a synthesis experiment where it's if they use our code base, they follow a standard procedure, we will kind of automatically be generating a set of comparable outputs for potentially a wide range of new sites that where we haven't tested the gap filling before. But I imagine it's for ONEFlux, I imagine Hausen that the data and format and data pipeline that's there is like very well established and carefully thought through. So I imagined it maybe as like an opt-in, so it's not like a burden on ONEFlux to kind of it could happen through that sequence, but the actual facilitation happens by directing those people to us, and we can help them work with the code, something like that.
Kyle, you had your hand up, and then we'll go to Hausen.
Sure, yeah, I wanted to make the point that I forget who I was mentioning that they need to help PIs with the data wrangling. Just wanted to point out that these conversations are also happening in the FLUXNet data initiative. And so there's a dovetailing there of there's a very large need there for people to help answering data wrangling questions. So I think these two efforts are going to merge, I would imagine, because most of the questions are synonymous. So I don't know what that model looks like yet for FLUXNet, but there will be synergies.
Great. Yeah, so folks online mentioned that it was hard to hear that.
Well, you can summarize.
Yeah, I'll summarize. So FLUXNet is for the data initiative. They're also having similar discussions on how do we facilitate or help groups get the data into basin and get into the network. So there's going to be a lot of synergies there and opportunities for collaboration.
And
so
appointing specific people to help. So those
okay.
helpers maybe.
And appointing specific people to help. So I'll just put a plug. If you're a Canadian site, you can come talk to us. Yeah, sorry. Hausen, you had your hand again?
I'll just show comment, just get back. I want to echo Gavin just mentioned. I think that's why we're talking to each other, right? As a working group, right? You guys working with a lot of PI, you have very close communication, you know the situation for all the site, and you have special interest in the mapping and all the supporting variables. So I think there's a good interface between ONEFlux and the PI, right? So you can give them some first-hand experience or guideline about how to prepare your data to ONEFlux. Something like this workshop is very valuable, I have to say. So you work like an interface and you provide some other I don't know, distill information to the PI about how you prepare and everything, and it work for us and for the PI and everyone. So I really appreciate this kind of effort.
Gilberto?
Yeah, just real quick on what Hausen just commented. I think these workshops, and we've been running workshops that are smaller groups of PIs and site teams where more people get to talk and express what are the conditions that they have challenges with, what are the situations where they need help with, and kind of creating these more direct communications between PIs and among more people in the community. I think this is something that seems to be helping a lot getting through that barrier of getting on board with the networks. And just very briefly, one thing that Gavin was mentioning, so for the data submission process for an experiment like you were describing, Gavin, we already support multiple variables of the same kind. So this should be a fairly simple process for us to kind of create the structure for you to send in that data. It would not be going through the standard gap QA/QC and gap filling and all that, but it would be made available and folks can use that as something that can be replicable and all that. So the infrastructure is there to support that kind of effort.
And one thing that Paul will be doing again is, with all the new influx of sites, particularly those in the tropics, which we haven't, had as many in FluxNet version 1, we are going to be running, this code base again across all the sites. So maybe there's also some opportunities to get back to the PI or have some sort of workshop where we present the data. They can weigh in on, does this map what they would expect? And so there could be sort of a two-way exchange there where, we can run it or they can run it, and then we can sort of have an exchange as to what works, what's the best approach, and then feed that into ONEFlux as well,
Yeah, I really like that idea. Thank you.
And then Matt, you can let us know how EcoProcedure works on methane, and then that can be, well, maybe not for ONEFlux, not yet, but we can get a sense of how these approaches work.
Sure.
Great. Yeah, and I love sharing code and resources, so more people like these discussions and want to chat. Sort of what I do when I'm not teaching or writing grants or supervising students. What I do in my spare time. Any other thoughts? Comments? We have time.
Yeah, I see a comment from Gavin. Yeah, I want to add again. Yeah, our pipeline is ready to be used for the ONEFlux base data set. So if you want to use the ONEFlux base data set directly, you can run our pipeline for the methane flux gap filling. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Just one. Yeah, thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah, thanks for writing the code for that. One small thing to keep in mind, though, is that the base format doesn't do the U-star filtering, which is also important for methane. So if you are following along with our pipeline, you can add an additional variable, and we can provide instructions on that. So to make sure, yeah, I mean, if you're submitting your data for the first time and using what we've presented, you can create a U-star filter variable. But if you're straight up downloading from the basin, it's not a U-star filter variable. So just something to keep in mind if you're testing this, if others are testing this on basin type data. But yeah, Paul and I will work on that to provide instructions on how to get that U-star filter data into basin so you can apply this pipeline to that variable. Another big topic, I think, is uncertainty, and that's something we haven't really tackled as much in the FLUXNet working group on N2O and methane. If anyone is, I know Gavin, you've been thinking about this a lot, and I think this is also where we would need to continue to be in touch with ONEFlux, is on how do we get uncertainty and uncertainty propagation, because this is, a big topic. I feel pretty confident in how I do it for CO2. I don't always feel that confident in how I do it for methane. I think it depends on how you gap fill your data, but even quantifying, random uncertainty, do we apply U-star uncertainty for methane? I mean, we did U-star filter methane based on the relationship with NEE. So there's that level of uncertainty, and then there's the whole gap filling uncertainty and, scaling uncertainty or not. So I do think that over the coming months, maybe one thing we can focus on is talking about uncertainty, and I don't know if anybody wants to weigh in on that point.
Just quick comment on uncertainty. Thanks for bringing this up. I just want to, starting from measurement, there are measurement random uncertainty in the measurement. I just want to everyone be cautious. So our project, we do run site visit. So we bring independent eddy current system to do the benchmarking, side-by-side comparison. For a few sites, they run methane, mostly 7700 open pass. We do see quite a lot of random uncertainty. Even you're using the same set of setup, process them in the same way side by side, you still see the value kind of vary, just plus minus 10, 20 nanomole per meter square per second. So if you run your methane open pass in a very low flux size, 10, 20 or something like that, be aware the random uncertainty is on the order of that. So gut feeling, I think everything we mentioned earlier about the uncertainty quantification, starting with assuming the data is right. Then you train your model and you do whatever you want. That's called model uncertainty. But if your measurement had come with some uncertainty plus minus 10 or 20, what does it mean for your uncertainty quantification? So just be aware we'll measure something and it always comes with uncertainty in your measurement. So it's not truth, I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's something too, again, why I think we need to, maybe have a couple breakouts over the next year is, I mean, if you're measuring with one site, how are you getting that random uncertainty? So, I mean, NEE, you're using like your MDS residuals to quantify uncertainty. Does that work for methane? Can you put in a different set of predictor variables to get at random uncertainty using a similar approach? Or do we do like we've done with the ANNs, so looking at like residuals between observed and model to try to parameterize some sort of uncertainty? And then there's, model uncertainty. But I do think this is an important topic that really gets in the weeds. But if there's anyone that's sort of interested in this, maybe you could send like me or Fa or Gavin an email. And obviously we want to include, the networks here and, those working on ONEFlux. But I think this is a really important topic that I have not resolved. So if anyone wants to get involved in this, I think this is an important topic.
So sorry, again, sorry for jumping. I cannot see if there are raised. I also cannot raise the hand basically because again, if I raise the hand, I crash. But I want to say two things. The first one is what Hauset said. Okay, imagine that in ICOS, for example, the open path methane is not a standard instrument accepted. And the reason is not the random uncertainty that is also important, but it's a systematic uncertainty that you can have due to the WPR correction. So I'm not saying that we should not use it. And if the fluxes are large, that's not anymore a big issue. What I'm saying is more that, again, the metadata and knowing exactly which sensor has been used and which sonic has been used for the methane measurements is crucial. Otherwise, you will never have a very clear understanding of uncertainty. Because in particular for methane and N2O, also the sensor that you use makes the difference. Also for CO2 a little bit, we know the open path and it's self-eating and whatever. The other point is, Sarah, just to be careful to not take the easy road, that is the uncertainty equal to the gap filling. I mean, should be demonstrated that the gap filling is really the uncertainty in the or the main uncertainty source. For the CO2, the decision to not use to not consider the gap filling for the uncertainty came from the evaluation that this was not a source of uncertainty, was more the uncertainty in the U-star filtering that was really the major source of uncertainty. So be careful to just not take what is more easy, let's say, because for the gap filling, we can play with the code, add additional variables, make random gaps, compare methods, that's all. We first have to understand if this is really the main source of uncertainty in the methane fluxes, and I suspect it's not.
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's something we are going to look at is a little bit more comparing the different sources of uncertainty, so the U-star filtering, and which also begs the question, how reliable is the NEE U-star threshold for methane? Something we've sort of started to explore in the FLUXNet methane N2O committee. But yeah, I don't think we've resolved all of these issues yet, but yes, we will be working on that, and Ba and I, and anyone else who's interested, have been thinking about this. Gavin?
Yeah, I think I've had an unresolved question for a while now, really since we published the gap filling paper that I think relates to this question about gap filling versus random versus U-star uncertainty contributions. And maybe could I share my screen one more time?
Sure. Yeah, who got that?
Yeah, I think it gets back to this plot, and so I'm uh, this idea here was that we can evaluate the spread of these 10 this 10 member ensemble of machine learning predictions for different sites, and for each site here there's an ANN and a random forest model, and the the this piece of this scaling part for the uncertainties was kind of driven by the interests of the curiosity of the computer science students who felt that it didn't make sense that it was wrong that without knowing all of the details of all the different uncertainty calculations that go into eddy covariance work, they felt that okay, the spread of the predictions from the machine learning ensemble should be approximately the same as the spread of the variance in the data naturally. That was their intuition, and so that's what brought us to this scaling approach. And I guess I've just wondered ever since, having done this, whether effectively by widening the uncertainty generated by the gap filling models, we're basically approximating the random uncertainty, because that's my understanding is that the MDS residual would essentially be the same. It's a measure of the distance between the MDS prediction and the true value, right? And so I wondered if essentially scaling here, we already incorporate this random uncertainty adjustment for any gap filled value, and just what the implications of that is. Does this mean that in some ways we're doubling up when we add uncertainties together, or is this irrelevant? I just curious to hear what people think who have more experience thinking about these different pieces of the uncertainty. I agree that maybe this is a more extended conversation, but I would be interested to hear even people's just gut reaction to this. Thanks.
Thoughts on it?
Yeah, I can want to add something. Like after reading like Gilberto's paper, ONEFlux paper, I found that for NEE, seemed you quantify the random uncertainty for NEE based on like a time window, like with similar like environment conditions, then and with NEE value, then calculate the spread or uncertainty range, then use this kind of uncertainty to quantify the random uncertainty of NEE, which is different from like what Gavin introduced here, the random uncertainty for ONEFlux. So yeah, I'm also thinking about how can we more like quantify this kind of uncertainty more consistently in the ONEFlux for different kind of flux variables.
Yeah, I wonder there if you're getting at exactly what is the only distinction then between the random and the gap filling uncertainty methods for NE versus what we did, which is that the way that the spread of the natural variance in the data was measured was across the whole year. And so then it was a matter of like, how can we scale the spread in the machine learning predictions by a factor that brings it closer to the natural spread across variance across in the whole year. Whereas I think it's better to do it by a window, because you have huge seasonal variations that are signals, not noise. And so I sort of wonder if like we maybe in the flux gap fill code base, the scaling could be adjusted to actually only consider a window around the predictions, and that would bring it more in line with NEE.
I mean,
Gilberto, you wanna? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would be a good way to do it. And another thing that we wondered about, and I don't think we really explored this that much, is how to define that window, right? And that seems to be intuitively it could be kind of ecosystem dependent or climate dependent, and whatever is driving the fluxes for that site might be also influencing the levels of uncertainty there. So yeah, I'm not sure that I have a good answer to this. But I will add one more complexity just for fun here. That is just the aspect of how, because Gavin, you're mentioning how equivalent things are, right? In terms of if we're starting to do the quantification from the gap filling, how close that is to just to the random uncertainty, to the measurement uncertainty. But there is the aspect also of compounding these uncertainties, right? And this is something that in some cases is not trivial to do. How do you propagate the different sources of uncertainty to the final product? So not to muddy the fun, or maybe add something else for us to have fun with. This aspect is something that I've been thinking about as well. How to meaningfully combine these things and make a product in the end that can be a little easier to use instead of having to consider all of these separate sources of uncertainty individually. Is there a way that we can kind of have this be combined as well? An ensemble of uncertainties. I really like the comments in the chat earlier. Someone was saying, I think Hausen was commenting on the uncertainty of the uncertainties. So I really like that line of thought, and I think there's a lot to explore there.
Yeah, I mean, last time what we did for version 1 is like, yeah, we added up the random uncertainty and the gap filling uncertainty and quadrature to get up with like a cumulative uncertainty. But then that brings back to Gavin's point: if the gap filling uncertainty is too low, we need to add the random uncertainty in the gap fill data, which we don't do because that's sort of uncertain too. But yeah, I don't know. I think we need a working group on this.
I mean, on this point, we need also to be careful of which is the scope. I mean, the random uncertainty per se, it's something that is not really an issue when you do the gap filling. I mean, the random uncertainty is a noise that, of course, have an impact, but the gap filling is always an interpolation and simplification. And there is a nice paper, in my opinion, from Vitale et al. I mean, where I'm also quadro, where he used a multiple input. He's a statistician, and he used this multiple imputation method, showing how other gap filling methods basically. If you look at this data distribution, so a PDF probability density function of the gap fill data is always more stringed and respect to the real data, and the reason is that the random component, the random uncertainty, is removed because just you interpolate, so you remove the noise basically. And so my point is that I think it's very important to consider the random uncertainty if you look and work on a single half hours. So you parameterize a model on a single half hours and measurements, but as soon as you fill the gaps because you go to the daily, I would say the random uncertainty is not anymore the big issue. And again, sorry to repeat, the big issue become more the biases that you can add, the fact that nighttime you have less data, the fact that with the WPL correction in the open path, you add a diurnal cycle in the fluxes that doesn't exist potentially, just because you have a sensible heat dynamic that you just put in the WPL correction. So I would say there are different sources of uncertainty. One has to be careful on what you are looking for and which kind of use of the data you want to do.
Yeah, definitely.
I have a thought I'd like to chime in. I kind of want to circle back to the sort of uncertainty associated with U-star filtering, and this is sort of based on my experience working with Arctic sites, where this broadly applies to partitioning NEE as well. You have 3 months of the year where the sun doesn't set, and so doing anything where you're taking just data with incoming shortwave radiation below, say, 10 watts per square meter just doesn't work. And so, I mean, I've done a lot of thinking on like how to circumvent that, and you know, perhaps this could be applied to U-star filtering as well. In other cases, it might be interesting to, say, train a model on data that isn't U-star filtered. You could even give it U-star as an input and look for, say, it identifying a breakpoint in U-star, or you could compare model predictions with U-star filtered data versus without U-star filtered data to see how they differ, and perhaps do that with different U-star thresholds to try and sort of figure out where that might be. So I don't know, it's just a general thought, having some issues with, you know, how best to go about applying this filter, particularly in situations where you have little, if any, data available during a season to generate that threshold.
Yeah, thanks, June.
Who's saying this?
June Skeeter.
Okay, can you send an email to me on this? Because Gilberto can explain. I had to disconnect now, but we were really having the same discussion today, but because of course it's valid for CO2 and for methane, and we were really having the same discussion today on which strategy to follow in sites where it's impossible. The Arctic, where it's always daytime, is one case. The other one is the urban, where you violate the assumption and you start calculation. So it would be nice to have a contact.
Yeah, I can reach out afterwards to continue a discussion on this.
I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, more broadly, I don't know, maybe we could have a small subgroup on uncertainty, but, or maybe you guys just do it one-on-one, but yeah, I think these are good points. Okay, great. Any other points people want to bring up? We don't necessarily need to use the full 2 hours if people are running out of it, you know, don't have anything else they want to add. Maybe I could just recap sort of what we discussed here. So yeah, working with putting methane into ONEFlux, so thinking about sort of a parsimonious approach, right? Weighing complexity and the benefits. So yeah, maybe, you know, if something is good enough, maybe that's just good enough to use. So we can think about that as we test different approaches over the next little while. Also thinking about, you know, for methane, what are the input variables to gap filling, and do we need additional sources for remote sensing? Thinking about uncertainty for this, and also revisiting it a little bit for CO2 under certain conditions. And then continuing to work with the community to help facilitate submissions to the networks and, you know, discussions around data policy. So I think those were some of the key points that we addressed today. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything. Okay. What was that? I'd like to thank everyone for
I thought you meant, I would suggest we ask people to take 5 minutes now to write some feedback or comments on the tutorial and what they found useful and helpful? Or maybe we can wrap up and then do that, just because while it's
Yeah.
on people's minds.
Sounds good. I do have a
Oh,
form
you do, okay,
that I will maybe quickly review and
okay.
send out to participants hopefully today.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can do it.
Not really short, but good, great, I just wanted to make sure we're doing it,
Yeah. So we have a follow-up, so maybe in this last half hour, we can finalize that form and get it sent out to everyone. But yeah, I want to thank, everyone for participating, both virtually and in person, and all the co-organizers. So Kyle was involved with this, Rob and Allison and Gavin were co-leads on the grant that funded this. And also a big shout out and a big thanks to everyone who presented. And Rosie for walking us through a day and a half of tutorials. So thank you for that. And if folks have any follow-up questions or anything that they wanna share, feel free to reach out to us and we'll be sending out some follow-up materials. So yeah, thanks everyone, and we're gonna continue these ongoing and fun discussions over the coming years. Thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.